Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition, or V5, is an RPG published by White Wolf in 2018, set in the World of Darkness mega setting, and distributed by Modiphius. It continues the long line of Vampire the Masquerade games that started in 1991 with Mark Rein-Hagen. The core book is 431 pages and contains everything needed to run a game. In fact, about a quarter of the book explains exactly how to run a game of Vampire. I'm going to try and brief you on everything that has happened with the game Vampire the Masquerade, but I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible because if you've already been following the saga over the years, it can be a bit redundant. I highly suggest the 2017 documentary World of Darkness, which is available on Amazon Prime Video. So here goes. In 1991, Mark Rein-Hagen flipped the script of the RPG world and allowed players to play as the monsters, specifically vampires. It was created under the fledgling company White Wolf and set in the wider so-called World of Darkness setting that would later include Werewolf, the Apocalypse, and Mage, the Ascension. The game exploded in popularity and a subculture of vampire LARPing blossomed through the 1990s, but as sales began to decline, White Wolf released an edition in 2004 called Vampire Requiem, which didn't resurrect early successes. Also around this time, they sued an international vampire fan club called Camarilla for infringement, as well as Sony for Underworld, which made them look bad. Then in 2006, White Wolf sold itself to CCP, the creators of EVE Online. CCP promised fans a Vampire MMO. It even released a much celebrated 20th anniversary edition of Vampire in 2011, referred to as V20. But when CCP's EVE business began to dip, they canceled the MMO entirely. Then in 2015, Paradox Interactive, makers of a bunch of decent PC games you've probably never heard of, bought all the rights, reformed White Wolf as a business entity, and put out this 5th edition 3 years later in 2018. I picked up this book and sank my teeth in without any bias against the addition or residual anger from its pre-release controversy, and just read it as an RPG. What I found within the four corners of this book is what I'm going to share with you in this video. The vampire world is set in the umbrella setting called World of Darkness, which encompasses all manner of dark and gothic monsters like vamps, werewolves, ghosts, ghouls, and the like, but you will only barely get a glimpse of anything other than vampires in this book. The world of Vampire is our own world, the modern day, but with a secret history of vampires, or kindred, going all the way back to the dawn of human civilization. As the kindred lore puts it, there was Adam and Eve, and then there was Cain and Abel, and Cain begat 3 children who then had 13 children, or childer, rather. And as Cain's punishment for killing his brother, God cursed these 13 childer with vampirism. Each of these 13 then gave rise to a different clan of vampires. Naturally, they fought against each other and against humans for centuries, and established a code of conduct that included the number 1 rule, hide thyself from mortals. This code was known as the Masquerade. Now let me fast forward to the present day, as presented in this book. There are now 16 generations of kindred, and interestingly, the 1st through 9th generations are not playable out of this core rulebook. As far as clans, only 7 of the 13 are still viable and thus available for players. The clans all fall into one sect or another, or they're independent. 2 sects come up a lot in this book, and they are the Camarilla and the Anarchs. Generally speaking, Camarilla tries to uphold the Masquerade and continue to assert dominance over humans and other kindred from the shadows, while the Anarchs want to both destroy the Camarilla and openly rule over mortals. There is also the Sabbat floating around that also opposes Camarilla ideology. As far as clans you can't play, La Sombra and Tzimisce have fallen to the Sabbat, Giovanni and Ravnos, driven nearly to extinction, and the Banu Hakim and Setite ministry have fallen into a limbo of war and were independent anyways. The Anarchs contain 2 playable clans, Bruja, countercultural, progressive, systemic anarchists, and Gangrel, feral outcasts, wanderers, and hunters. And that leaves 5 clans under the sect of Camarilla. The Malkavians, deranged visionaries, oracles, and seers, Nosferatu, malformed and hideous spies and bottom dwellers, but usually with hearts of gold, the Toreador, sensualists, hedonists, and self-absorbed twisted artists, the Tremere, arcane outcasts, witches, and warlocks, and the Ventru, the leader caste, patricians of old lineage. Then there are the Caitiff, which are kindred without a clan, generally speaking. Each of these playable clans comes with 3 disciplines or types of vampiric power and 1 bane, or core gameplay disadvantage. I thought a really cool feature of this book was the option of players to get a so-called lore sheet at player creation. There are 25 of these, some of which are limited to certain clans. They each contain a snippet of setting lore and offer 5 levels of advantage to a player. These sheets really embody how the vampire setting and history is infused with actual game mechanics. The beating heart of the mechanics in Vampire is the D10 dice pool. Almost everything about your character, the core attributes, skills, disciplines, and advantages and flaws are all rated 0 to 5, and those represent the number of D10s you can throw on a check involving that item. If the roll comes up a 1 through 5, that is a failure. If the roll is a 6 through 10, that is a success. If you happen to get 2 10s on a single throw, that is counted as a critical success, which generates 2 extra successes for that check. The number of successes you need to win a test depends on the situation, but generally ranges from 1 success for something dead simple to 7 or more successes for something godlike. If you throw more successes than what is called for, this additional margin of success can count towards damage in combat or an advantage in other contests. When you take damage, it is either health points or it is damage to one's willpower pool. Furthermore, it can either be superficial damage or aggravated damage. Superficial damage to a vampire counts kind of like a half point of damage, and is something like a bullet wound, a stab with metal, being hit with a car, or anything less severe. Aggravated damage for a vampire includes sunlight, a bite or claw from a supernatural entity, a wooden stake to the heart, fire, and a few other things. Once your kindred character loses enough health points, they enter what is called a torpor, or sleep state that renders them completely vulnerable to further damage and can lead to final death. Recovering health and willpower points naturally is relatively slow and difficult. Recovering them quickly risks taking on hunger. The mechanics get a little more complicated with hunger dice. There is a point pool with 5 slots at the bottom of the character sheet called hunger. There are a number of ways to pick up hunger points, including using a discipline, mending damage, and even the act of waking up for the night. But hunger points are bad for you, and here's why. There are a few exceptions, but for every hunger point, when you have to roll a pool of dice, you replace 1 die with a hunger die for each hunger point that you have. The hunger dice act as regular dice for the most part, except if a hunger die comes up as a 1 and you happen to fail the whole roll, you have earned a bestial failure, which leads to a compulsion. Compulsion examples in the book include needing to feed immediately, lashing out in uncontrollable violence, or behaving in a bad way that is particular to your clan. Hunger dice will punish you even if you succeed. If a hunger die comes up a 10 and there is at least 1 other 10 in the pool that you just threw, this is a messy critical, which leads to something materially bad like a stated advantage being degraded by a point, or revealing oneself to humans and violating the Masquerade. As a normal kindred, you start with 7 out of 10 humanity points, and you can gain these through compassionate behavior or lose them by answering to the call of your inner beast. Humanity represents how close a vampire is to their human life, to specific people who draw them to life, and to human concerns generally. The book goes into detail on what each of the 10 levels of humanity entail from a game mechanics perspective. Of the mechanics that I described so far, it doesn't seem that complicated, but the book does go on to describe more and more rules of the road for being a vampire. There's a lot of detail on blood potency, which is how strong your vampiric powers are. It is very involved and is one of the few places in the book where the designers could not avoid a big table. Then there is blood resonance, where kindred actually pick up one of 4 kinds of mystic energies from their blood victim. These are necessary for advancing disciplines and can lead to dyscrasias, or distinct powers all their own. Then there are rules about what happened to you if you drink other vampires, and ways to create blood bonds with others. Is it too much? This game is not crunchy, but there are a lot of rules related to blood consumption. There are 9 core attributes divided into 3 categories of physical, social, and mental. You get to distribute 22 dots amongst these attributes after a fashion. Then there are 27 skill categories, with any kind of fill-in-the-blank subspecialty you can think of. At the start, you get 24 dots to distribute amongst these skills, with some restrictions. Disciplines are categories of supernatural vampiric powers, of which there are 12. They all have different costs, and each are sorted into 5 levels of power. So for example, Protean is the discipline of shapeshifting and is initially available to members of the clan Gangrel. It contains the following powers. The earlier powers in any of these disciplines typically don't have a cost, but the more powerful ones require harder skill checks and 1 or more rouse checks, or high-low dice throws to see if you pick up a hunger point or not. The game's authors try to go full throttle on both sides of the spectrum here. On one hand, as we've seen, they've provided a full-fledged dice-rolling RPG with dozens of dice-modifying rules, but on the other hand, they stress over and over how much the story at the table matters more. There are many fiction-first features, including the fact that it's not a game master who leads a session, it's a storyteller, and it's not a non-player character, but a storyteller player character. There are many features in the background aspects of the character that have little or no mechanical bearing on the game, but are actually very important for a session if run in the spirit of the creator's original intent. One of my favorite of the softer details that players are asked to choose at the start are their coterie, or small group that the gaming party belongs to. I think these are so intriguing because they bring together a party thematically right out of the gate and inform the storyteller on narrative direction, at least at the beginning of a campaign or chronicle. Of course, a group's coterie doesn't lock them into a mode of behavior across an entire chronicle. There's not enough time in this video to cover the quarter of this book that deals with the tools for the storyteller. These sections include advanced game mechanics such as extended tests, alternative ways to run conflicts, setting information, and a lot of talk about how to run a whole vampire chronicle with different overarching themes. I do appreciate all of this additional information. You can tell from all of it that the authors take the franchise seriously and want to welcome fledgling storytellers as warmly as possible with all of the advice that they could possibly need. So here are my thoughts. Cons. The book oscillates wildly between claiming to be fiction first, but also providing a tremendous amount of mechanical minutia. It's not exactly crunch, but there are countless little rules and rule exceptions listed, even as the book at one point literally says that the number one rule is that there are no rules. Baggage. The franchise has baggage. From the bad press over the years, the old broken promises, and the unavoidable edition wars waged by some fans. Stories in this game can take on many different themes, but if you're playing by the rules of the game, there is always going to be a strong addiction element. Addiction in most other games is usually just a novelty mechanic or subplot, but here you're going to deal with it almost constantly. Pros. Matured and polished game. You need to look no further than the character creation process in this game to see that it is the end result of decades of playtesting and refinement over multiple editions. Realism in the mechanics. Being a vampire is a struggle and not all that romanticized at any point in the book. Some of the vampiric powers are a bit overpowered in my opinion, such as the mind control powers, but the constant threat of hunger keeps things pretty grounded and serious. Communities. There are countless communities online for rules, support, and play. In my experience, they are almost always willing to embrace new players, and if you're looking for players of your own to play online, you will very likely find some. So there you have it, Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. I think the pros outweigh the cons on this one by a long shot. I can't speak for the previous versions, but V5 is a remarkable RPG. Let me know what you think of this game. Thanks to Andy Doherty and Elmer Gilbert for helping me iron out the details in this video, and thanks to you for watching. This is Dave signing off. See ya.